Hi, thanks for joining me today. We're continuing our discussion in the Fourth Amendment, and we're specifically talking about warrants. Today I'm going to be discussing what happens in situations where there are errors in execution of a search warrant. Sometimes a police officer or a team of police officers might try and go execute a search warrant, and then they learn as they're executing the search warrant that the circumstances are a little different than they had originally thought. So let's say that a team of police officers are executing a search warrant, and of course we'll assume that the search warrant is valid, that the judge had signed the search warrant and found that there was probable cause for the search warrant. So we're not attacking the warrant document itself. What we're looking at is how the police officers actually go about the execution of the search warrant. So let's say a team of police officers go to a location to execute a search warrant, and the search warrant allows them to search the third floor apartment of a suspect, and the suspect's apartment is the third floor. So the police officers go up to the third floor, enter, and start searching, and they find drugs and drug paraphernalia. And once they're inside the unit, they realize that, well, wait a second, there are two units on the third floor, not just one. They went into the wrong unit for the wrong person. So they go into the other unit and do the search that the warrant had actually approved. But they still collect all that evidence, the drugs and the drug paraphernalia for this other person, and then they arrest that other person for the drug possession and paraphernalia offenses. So this case ended up going before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court was looking at whether or not that evidence should have been excluded, whether the police officers had violated the Fourth Amendment by doing that search of the one unit rather than focusing on the unit that the warrant should have specified. And what the Supreme Court ultimately decided is that the police officer's actions in that situation was reasonable because the warrant allowed a search of the third floor of the person's apartment, which they believed was the third floor. They didn't know that there were two units on the third floor rather than just one. And in that situation, the Supreme Court found that the search was reasonable. They weren't going to penalize the prosecution and the police officers by suppressing that evidence just because it turns out they had learned something during the search that they didn't know beforehand. So that's one instance where the Supreme Court has said that a search, even though there was an error in the execution of the warrant, right? They had searched one of the wrong unit. They searched the wrong place, but they had said in that situation that search was reasonable. That error was a reasonable error. They're not going to suppress the evidence in that situation. If we change the facts up, the evidence may have been suppressed. So let's say that this is an apartment building, and the warrant just says you can search his apartment on the third floor, or his apartment which is on the third floor. And then the police officers get up there and they see multiple doors with multiple unit numbers. I think in that situation, it would be unreasonable for a police officer to just go into a random unit and start searching around. So there are situations and changes in facts where we could make a stronger argument that a search was unreasonable rather than reasonable. But in that situation, what the Supreme Court was looking at, those specific facts, the Supreme Court said that it was reasonable. The error that the police officers made was not so unreasonable. So another situation that the Supreme Court had looked at was, so police officers get a warrant to search somebody's home, and they serve the warrant, go into the home, and they learn that the person doesn't even live there anymore. It's a completely unrelated person who lives there. The previous person that they were looking for had actually moved out 3 months before. And the police went in, they detained, it was actually a couple that lived there, they detained the couple, did a sweep of the area to see whether or not anybody else was there. Turns out there wasn't. They'd clearly made a mistake, and they left. and they didn't stay very long. I think they had left within 15 minutes of going in. So that situation ended up in front of the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court ultimately decided is that the police officer's conduct was not unreasonable. The police officers didn't know that the person had moved, and once they had learned of their mistake, they ended the search. They didn't continue prying into the people's individual privacy interests. So are there facts that we can add to that scenario that would make the situation more unreasonable? Yeah, of course there are. So, let's say that the police officers, even after they had learned of their mistake, continued to search. Or let's say, even after they learned of their mistake, they detained the people for an unnecessarily long amount of time. So those kinds of facts, if we added them, could make a situation more unreasonable and give a stronger argument for showing that something unreasonable did happen. But under these specific facts that the Supreme Court was looking at in both of those cases, the Supreme Court ultimately found that those searches were reasonable. They were not unreasonable. So those are two examples of how errors when a search warrant is being executed could ultimately be found to be reasonable errors, or under different facts could be unreasonable. It really depends on the facts of each individual situation. So thank you for joining me and watching this video. If you think that some of these factual scenarios sound like something you're dealing with, then make sure you consult with an attorney. Because these cases are so fact-specific, they don't really apply to everybody or every set of facts. That's why it's important that you consult with an attorney for your specific situation. But thank you for joining me today. I hope to see you in the next video.